So in this session at our community of practice, where we often take a moment first to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathering. I'm here in the land of the water-wearing people of the Kulin Nation in what is now known as Victoria. And I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging, and their stewardship of this land, and that this land was never ceded. You might like to take a moment for yourself to connect in with the traditional owners of the land on which your feet are placed today. I thought we'd kick off with a little poll today, just to get a sense of who's on the call, who's joining us, and where we are, both geographically and where we are in our systems practice. So I'm going to launch a poll now. What will happen is you'll have a little pop-up window pop up in front of you, and you have a few minutes to drop some answers in there, and we'll just get a sense of who's joining us and from where on the call today.
I don't see anything for South Australia. I'm sorry. I have to put it elsewhere.
Sure, okay.
I saw all other states, but not South Australia. So I'm a forgotten land, way down under there.
Yeah, no problem. I'll message you in the chat and see if we can get that organized for you.
Thank you.
So for some folks, if you're not seeing the poll, that it might be a version issue. It might be something that you've got in terms of your desk setup. It comes up as a separate window. So it's not overly critical. It's just a nice little drop-in that we like to have. So I'll just leave that open for another 30 seconds or so. We've got a great group on the call today, 61 people joining us. And so Nam has shared where he's from. So if you don't have the poll, perhaps you'd like to write where your feet are planted on the ground today, where you're joining us from, and what's your level of familiarity with systems. So I'm going to close the poll here, and we got almost everybody. And just to share some results. So we've got lots of folks here in Victoria and across Australia, a couple of folks joining in from Canada and New Zealand today. A few newbies, but lots of folks who've got some good experience with systems thinking. So you've been working with the concepts, or you've already been applying in your work. Some of you are teaching others, and some of you are researching in systems. Lots of you are new to the systems community of practice, so welcome. And 3 of you who've been here since the beginning, so fantastic. And the last question that I asked was about which system are you working in? And I know I didn't get all of them, but this was just a bit of a sense. So about half of you are working in health and well-being, about 10 in the environment, a couple from social justice and education, nobody in the resources and industries system or the legal system, but a few from government and policy, and a couple of you in something else. So if you're in something else, maybe drop into the chat and let us know what system that is that you're working in. So it's great to just get a sense of who's joining us on the call today. And if you didn't have a poll, I apologize about that. I think Zoom is going through some growing pains. I've heard there's something like 90 million accounts or something insane like that have expanded on Zoom in the last little while as we're all going through this new phase. So I just wanted to share a little bit, particularly there's a number of you who are new to the systems community practice. So we, as I say, we gather about monthly to deepen our practice in systems, and we have a couple of principles. And one of those is to be accessible. So we've been using the Zoom platform and working virtually since the beginning. And that's because often as systems practitioners, we're quite isolated in the work that we're doing. We're often one, if or only of a handful in our organizations or our communities who are working in this way. And we really wanted an opportunity to create relationships, create points of connection for us as practitioners to find each other and work and learn together. What we do here is, I'm very much just the host, and we often are learning from others in our community about what they're doing. So peer engagement is a big aspect of what we do here in peer learning. Over the years, we've heard that lots of you have actually joined up on projects. You continue to have a professional development relationship beyond this space, and I really encourage you in that way to use this as a launching pad in those connections that you make with other systems practitioners. The law of 2 feet in this is that we invite you to join when you can be fully present and engage with us. And our topics change often. So it's finding the ones that are in alignment with you and your learning needs. And the last one that is often particularly important is patience is a virtue. And that's really relevant to this online space because things don't always go smoothly. Case in point, the poll not opening for everyone today. So I ask that you be kind to each other and be kind to yourself as we figure out how to engage in this online space. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Ray Ison, who is on the call with us today. And Ray is the reason, actually, I'm going to get meta Ray right out of the gate. So not only is he the immediate reason that we are gathering today, but he's actually the ultimate reason why all of this is happening, because I came to work in Australia, and as a matter of steps following from that, have established a system school as a result of working with Ray. And I consider that a real privilege and honor to have had this opportunity to learn and work with Ray. He has been a strong voice for systems thinking and systems practice for many years. He straddles both working in Australia and the UK. He's the professor of systems at the Open University in the UK, and is deep in practice, often working in the field and across many continents as well. So I'm going to open up for Ray if you would like to turn your mic on, and we'll be in conversation today. So our approach to today is we're going to sit and interview and hear from Ray more about his practice, but also his book and what he would love for us to take away from that. And we'll have a nice chunk of time towards the end to be in question and answer period with each other. So we'll switch over the camera now to just the two of us speaking, and we'll take it away. So Ray, welcome. It's wonderful
Thank you,
to
Seanna.
have you here. Yeah. I shared some questions with you, and the first one that I'd like to ask you to start off with is to tell us a little bit about how you came to systems. Where did your journey begin with systems thinking?
Thanks, Seanna. This is always an intriguing question. It's a question I often ask researchers and people in my workshops and other things of that nature, and it's always a choice you make in the moment as to where to start the question. Do we talk about my start as a human being born into a particular set of circumstances and culture, living in language, or do I start much later? In my case, on the central tablelands of New South Wales, into a farming community and a farming family. involved in dynamics of agriculture, and then an agricultural degree at the University of Sydney. Someone who was challenged or put off by certain aspects of the curriculum that I encountered, particularly the way they dealt with people, which didn't seem to deal with people very well. And of course, the demarcation between what some people might call the nature-human divide, or the biophysical world and the social world. So those have all been issues of concern to me. And perhaps the one I'll just focus on is that when I left university, I aspired to go and work in development in tropical agriculture and other places in developing countries. And for a long time, I couldn't get a job or an opening because I didn't have experience. And the challenge was, how do you get experience when you don't have experience? I travelled overland, went to visit a lot of development projects, gradually built up a lot of exposure to development situations, ended up doing field work for my PhD in Bali in Indonesia, which was a marvellous learning experience for me. And out of all of those opportunities came a conclusion on my part that actually I didn't want to go and work in development when I'd finished my PhD, because what I'd experienced was a lot of what Robert Chambers described as development failure. A lot of projects were set up with good intentions by the developers, but most of them didn't seem to me to work very effectively. And my conclusion out of that experience was that the failure was due primarily to the worldviews and ways of thinking of the developers. And so I made a choice that I would come back and work in Australia in education so that I could begin to explore how people thought about situations and acted in situations, which is really how I came to be involved in systems thinking from an early career at what was then Hawkesbury Agricultural College, now part of the Western Sydney University.
We stepped right into all of the big concepts straight out the gate, didn't we? Systems, boundaries, as part of even the way to respond to that first question. I love it. One of the things that has been my greatest learning from you is thinking about systems not just in terms of academic concepts, but systems as practice. And you've already started to allude to that a little bit. And I wonder if you could share with us, what is the core of your systems practice? What is the thing that is most fundamental to you in your systems practice?
Well, in my work, starting back from Hawkesbury days, I was again, I became distressed by the way in which academics excluded the social world from the biophysical world. My experience of farming was that it was worthwhile understanding farming as a human activity systems, not necessarily just biophysical or agro-ecosystems, that there are always people involved in some way or form. And of course, even if you're a pure ecologist these days and only concerned with the natural world, we humans have assumed a role in the world where we subsume all the world to us, because we demarcate it, we call it pristine, we call it natural, all of these things. So you can never leave us out of consideration. And so I would say the primary concern or primary interest of my practice is always to put the practitioner into the practice and to understand practice as an embodied, situated action of people who live in language and think and act and frame situations in particular ways.
Thank you. Yeah. And one of the things that in my learning on doing that with you is also to help those that I work with, to orient them to how my practice differs from other ways of engaging in systems thinking, or a way that others practice systems thinking. And I'm just wondering if you can, for those on the call today, how would you differentiate your approach to systems from kind of the broader systems landscape? Folks on the call today might be coming from different disciplinary areas coming into systems thinking. So how would you orient yourself to the way that others work in systems as well? What's kind of the distinguishing factor perhaps between?
Okay, thanks for that. Well, let me, I mean, I always think it's good to answer a question if you can, in a way that you can ground it in your own experience. And one of the first jobs I had at Hawkesbury when I was a young academic was to organise an international conference around what was then called farming systems research. It was where I met many famous systems people, including Peter Checkland and others for the first time. And what was interesting about that conference was that it very quickly developed a schism within the conversation around how people viewed systems. Some people saw farming systems as things in the world which you could study, describe, model, and do all sorts of things to do, predict, optimize, etc. And that framing was often, of course, excluding humans from the farming system because they were seen in biophysical terms only. And there were another group who thought, no, we think it's better to think of systems as a device for engaging with situations so that we can learn about them, change them, transform them for the better. So in technical language or jargon, some people see systems as ontologies, things in the world. Some people see systems as epistemologies, as ways of knowing about situations so that you can understand systemically, act on them systemically, and learn your way into change of situations. So that's, I guess, one key distinction. The other experience I would say I had was when I took up the chair of systems at the Open University in the UK. I entered a milieu in universities and in culture where you weren't really judged particularly a good professor of systems unless you developed your own method. So everyone was into method and methodology, or technique and tools. And of course, I mean, this was a very macho type of thing. You know, my method is better than your method. And I'm not going to, as one colleague said to me, well, academics would rather share their toothbrush than share each other's theory or practice. I was determined not to enter into these methodology wars because my focus was to start with the situation and the practice and say that methodology only makes sense as it is enacted in a particular situation by a particular practitioner, and it's their performance of method or methodology that matters. And so we, in our education program at the Open University, have a heuristic which we call the PFMS heuristic. This is to understand practice as a systemic relational dynamic. If you always have a practitioner always has a history and a particular tradition of understanding out of which they think and act. We always engage with situations, we're always situated in our practice, and we bring our history, our past ways of thinking to that situation, and we frame that situation in particular ways. And one of the ways, of course, to frame a situation is to think of it or parts of it as if it were a system. And we engage with it with methods, tools, techniques, etc. And the way the PFMS dynamic plays out determines on how effective your performance is as a practitioner and what you learn. And you can learn about everything from yourself, the methods, the theory, the situation, etc.
Thanks so much for that. It's fascinating too that as practitioners in systems, we would ever kind of want to be in competition even with our methods when we can also appreciate that we know our way to respond to the systemic challenges that we face is to bring together those disparate parts and try and create that whole greater than the sum of the part. And that should, you know, really come all the way down into the methods and the tools that we're building, rather than them being in combination or competition, to think about how they can sit together and offer us greater insight, you know, a sequence in our way of working. But competition always seems to infiltrate at a point.
Sorry, just to pick up on, so that listeners there, I mean, I forgot to say hi to everyone and welcome you all to this conversation, and thank you for being here. So my apologies for not saying that earlier, but I do want to make it clear that I'm very much in favour, and think, and have spent a lifetime thinking that it makes sense to engage with the world systemically and to think in systems terms, because you, as we might say later, and given current circumstances, what's going on at the moment, we see all around us the failings of being able to think and act in systemic terms.
Which brings us beautifully into the next question I had for you, which is, what is the opportunity that you think that systems thinking offers us? What is that thing that it offers us if we're to work in this way, kind of the benefit or the offering that it brings to the world that we're sitting in right now? Why would we want to work in this way?
Well, I've been thinking about how to best address this question, and I guess the thing that we all as participants in this conversation have in common is that we are living through the current pandemic. And so perhaps if I ground my answer in that situation, we might be all able to relate to it. So you can use systems ideas to interpret the past. And in terms of the pandemic, we can think about it as an exemplar of the breakdown of humans' relationship with the biosphere, the emergence of novel organisms which come from disturbance, practices, selections, our own creation through global travel and flight, a perfect niche for the expansion of a organism that flourishes with great global connectivity between people. And we've spent much of our time trying to break down that global connectivity between us as humans to mitigate or to dampen the spread, flatten the curve, as they say. But in the first instance, it was a failure of relationship between us and the biophysical world, because organisms evolve all of the time, they emerge, and epidemiologists and public health officials have been predicting and understanding these phenomena for some time and have had many policies in place to deal with it. But the other thing that systems can provide with is core concepts, like connectivity in this case. But another one is the idea about initial starting conditions. So one of the initial starting conditions, once the virus emerged, was the governance system that existed in Wuhan and China at that time. And my reading of the situation is that the governance system failed to deal with the emergent difference and the emergent information that was coming from situated understandings of practitioners, and they failed to act and created a set of initial starting conditions that led to a particular trajectory and delayed action in the world by a significant period of time. So, I mean, we can discuss all of that, and a lot of those historical interpretations are being disputed and contested at this particular moment. But systems, concepts, ideas allow you to do that interpretation. Some systems approaches allow you to model and predict dynamics and unfolding population dynamics and other things of that nature, and that's a key aspect of systems thinking. But I guess the one that I'm most interested in, and I think is the most pressing at the moment, is the one about how governance systems either function or don't function. And that's what our new book with Ed Straw, written with Ed Straw, is all about.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Ray. And so, well, tell us a little bit about what brought you to write this book. What was the here and now? Why was the here and now the right place and time for this book to come forward?
For the past 20 years or so, I've done a lot of research and work in the space of rivers, water catchments, and what we might have originally called their management, but which I now call their governance. And that came on the back of earlier work, which was about what I'll call participatory decision-making, participatory action research, and these things. Going right back to my development failure days, I realised that development failure was often a failure because you failed to involve or enable the participation of local people in the development process, or to bring multiple perspectives to bear on how you frame the development process. And so I did a lot of work on participatory approaches like rapid rural appraisal, participatory rural appraisal, these types of things, and learned through that experience that participation in these contexts is absolutely necessary, but it was rarely ever sufficient, that you never got out of the situation what was ultimately needed, because often the benefits of participation fail to get institutionalized and built into practices and arrangements that continued and delivered the benefits of the participation. And as I worked in that mode in river systems, where we engaged and thought expanded our concerns about participation into what we call social learning, we showed how effective these processes could be in bringing multiple stakeholders together, devising effective action, working collaboratively together, engaged in practices that these days in Victoria might be called co-design practices, for example, or we call these days systemic co-inquiry. But again, we knew how to do this. We knew it worked well. We knew you could affect significant and positive outcomes, but rarely did it sustain beyond the immediate action, because again, it failed to be institutionalized or built into governance arrangements. And so it was the ongoing failure of governance systems that really alerted me or took my attention. And when I came back for a period of time to Monash, when we worked together, Seanna, I had set up the research unit there called the Systemic Governance Research Program. And I, in this process, became very, very critical of the way in which government operated. And by this time, I'd worked in China, in South Africa, in Britain, in Australia, and other places. So I had a perspective on governance that arose out of all of these places. There are different governance systems, and began to articulate this, and ultimately met up with my co-author, Ed Straw, who'd had a different career, a different set of experiences, working very closely, often in government and big consultancy firms, but had arrived at the same conclusion, that if we were to address the exigencies of the Anthropocene, to address the climate emergency that we are in and still in, then we had to address the failings of our contemporary governance systems. I can say a little bit more between what I mean about governance and government later, perhaps.
And so that brings us to the book now. And so it sounds like, governing being ultimately about people, how people are coming together, how they're making decisions together, how those decisions are, as you become institutionalized or rooted into our systems, or their failure to do that. And so in your book, you're applying all of these to the climate emergency. And so can you tell us a little bit about the key messages and concepts that you share in your book about governance and applying it to the climate emergency?
Okay. Perhaps for those who haven't had a chance to sort of look it up, or just to even scan through the table of contents, I mean, the book's organised initially by addressing the whole issue of, well, why do we humans find it so difficult to change and change fundamentally? And we draw on the concepts, the distinctions we make between what we call first order change, which is perhaps colloquially put as making the current system better, and second order change, which is about changing the whole system. And we think there's far too much first order change happening in the world and not enough second order change. So that's chapter one. In the next three chapters, we unpack why we think contemporary governance systems are failing, and we exemplify that with a particular case study of what we call preferential lobbying. So one of the problems I had, and I'm not sure about others, is that when we talk about governance and trying to understand government as a system, we don't often have a language to do that, and we don't have a systemic appreciation of what the different elements are. It took me a long, long time to begin to think about what these were, because I didn't have a background in this, but I'm not sure even the people with backgrounds in it think about it systemically. So I developed a heuristic, which we call the governance diamond. And if you want to think about contemporary governance systems, then it's generally made up of the state, law, civil society, the private sector, and floating around in there between different ones is the media. Now, think of each of those things as a sort of set of Russian dolls. And inside, or if you want to use systems language, there's a state system which is composed of many, many subsystems, or many, many Russian dolls inside it. And whether that's the executive, the parliament, parastatals, etc., etc. So there's a whole plethora of organisations and institutional arrangements that sit inside each of these. And if you look around and think seriously, you can find all sorts of failings going on in each one, whether it's in the state, whether it's in the law, whether it's in civil society, whether it's in the private sector, and whether it's in the media. And we probably don't have time to talk about all of those, but there's also problems in the interactions between them, or what we might call emergent properties that relate from the failure or the breakdown of those different elements. And that's where we put preferential lobbying. And if you live in Australia, you understand in every state, preferential lobbying operates to distort the functioning of the state in the interests of a select few. And we quote data which shows that the return on capital invested from preferential lobbying by private sector and other interests is massive. It's the best money you can make in town. That's why so many people spend money doing it. And this, of course, distorts what it is that we as citizens want. I mean, we rock up to a polling station once every 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years and put a tick in a box, and we think we've enacted our contribution to the governance system and our preferences. But this is not how it operates. And we've got ways to deal. We describe ways to act to try and overcome preferential lobbying. But we go further and say that the current model doesn't work because most of the institutions and arrangements were developed before humans recognised that we were a force of nature, changing whole Earth dynamics, what some people call the Anthropocene. It was before the growth of global capital in the forms of multinational companies that are more powerful than, say, 70% of nation states and dictate terms to nation states. It's before the growth of global connectivity through technology and the way that distorts or creates a particular news and media cycle. So the majority of institutional arrangements that permeate our governance systems are, in our view, no longer fit for purpose and need to be reconsidered. And we think that there are three elements, three subsystems fundamentally missing. We fell into a trap in the post-Second World War years and with the environmental movement where, together with neoliberal economics, we classified the environment as an add-on, as an externality, rather than recognising the biosphere as absolutely central to everything that we do. And so the biosphere is not central to our governance arrangements. The environment is an externality or a peripheral from which we add on. So we present a model, a three-dimensional model, which puts the biosphere central to our concerns into the future. We humans have also added to the biosphere so much technology that the biomass that we humans have produced is almost as great as what the Earth has produced itself in terms of biomass. This is what people call the technosphere. And we live in a world where we think that technology and its development and its rampant progress can be left to market forces or laissez-faire capitalism. We don't bring it into the purvey of human consideration and purposeful action. And thirdly, we argue that the institutions of the state are no longer adequate as primary arbiters of human purpose to deliberate on and negotiate human purpose about complex, intractable, super wicked issues such as the climate emergency, such as gross inequities and poverty, biodiversity loss, need institutions that operate in the long term and learn their way constantly into an unfolding future, and that the current operation of the mechanisms of the state are not capable of doing this. So we advocate for the invention and institutionalization of new arrangements, which we call institutions of social purpose. And you can, if to give an exemplar of that, in Australia, we humans came together, we as citizens of Australia, although it wasn't Australia then, we citizens of various states got together in the 19th century, had constitutional conferences and discussions, created a constitution, and which is a particular institution, and then set it in stone in 1900. And we live in a world now where we think this is immutable, that somehow we can't change this, and that it's stuck there. And we should have an ongoing constitutional convention, a deliberation in which citizens who rotate through particular roles with particular expertise should be constantly negotiating and renegotiating our constitutional settlement in the context of an unfolding Anthropocene, as one example. And I'm only up to chapter 5. Sorry.
No, there's so much to unpack there, and I'm just wondering where to begin. But when you were starting on this response, one of the things that came to mind was kind of almost the distributed nature of power that we actually hold as individuals in the system, and kind of our lack of awareness of what might be possible should that power become connected and kind of utilized and work towards a shared purpose. And now you've just articulated what that shared purpose could be, which is to reconvene around how we govern ourselves. And your book is articulating the urgency under which we need to do that, because we're experiencing these meta-system collapses, the climate emergency, the effects of what's happening in the biosphere. I'm wondering if, I'm going to practice, and I'm wondering how do we, because I think we can sit and appreciate and understand everything that you've just shared, and then we sit with what, and your question that I repeat often in the community of practice and in my teachings, what do we do when we do what we do? And so where might we begin with this journey that you've brought in front of us right now? Where would we begin, or how would we begin to practice in this way to reconvene around how we govern ourselves and what our roles are in this opportunity?
Well, these are big questions, and the first thing I'd like to say is that our book is an exploration of these issues based on our experience and our interpretation of these things. It's not a blueprint for the future, and it will require the creativity of all of us to move forward. But it does require us to stand up as individuals and to challenge build a reflexivity in our own living about what it is that we do when we do what we do, and can we do things differently. I think the first thing is that we've got to begin to have a conversation, both individually, in groups, and nationally and internationally, about the adequacy of our governance systems, and try and avoid this being contaminated or tainted by historical politics and the culture wars that have existed in various places. Very difficult to do, I admit. But I think some of the systems, language and concepts can help us in this regard. And if you take one concept which I think is really quite critical about this, which I've applied to governance systems, and that is a structure-determined system. I mean, I don't necessarily blame a lot of politicians for doing what they do when they do what they do, because what they're doing is what the system enables them to do and constrains them to do. It's the design of the system itself that builds their practices. So when you have a 3-year election cycle, only one out of those years where you can do very much, where you've got a media cycle, where you've got a party system, where you've got ideological wars operating inside party systems, etc., etc., then the system can only do what that particular structure enables it to do. And so I guess the main thing is we've got to, in the first instance, have this conversation about what is possible. I think the second thing is that we can't, if we have this conversation and we think of new ways or new structures, new institutions, if we inhabit them with the old practices and the old ways of thinking, then we won't have gained very much. So in the book, we talk about what it means to invest or to build or to recover what I call our systemic sensibilities. I think we humans have lost our capacity to think and act relationally, which I think is a fundamentally evolutionary property. We young Homo sapiens are born into what starts out pretty, for most, unfortunately not everyone, is a loving world which is replete with relational dynamics, relationships between and with, and that developing language is a relational phenomenon. And that as we are educated and move out, we move from what I call a systemic sensibility into a systematic sensibility,
Mm.
a linear cause and effect type world where A
Mm.
causes B rather than a multiple causality and interrelationship and dynamics.
Mm.
So I would talk about first is about how we collectively recover our systemic sensibility, particularly our relational dynamics with the biosphere, with other species and with each other. These are the really big questions. And how do we invest in what we call systems literacy? There are very few programs in the world that actually have a full program of education and training that engages people with the full array of material in systems and cybernetics and complexity theory that develops the literacy that I think we need for our times.
Mm.
It's not the only one, but it's missing in action at the moment.
Mm.
And as we do in our program at the Open University, we're interested that people take this literacy and make it into a practical action. And we call that systems thinking in practice capability. In our recent book launch, some people from the OECD and Eileen Munro, who did the child safety review for the UK government and used systems approaches, made the point that no manager or leader worth their salt these days is not able to say that we are faced with complex and wicked issues. Everyone says that, but often they don't go beyond just saying it.
Mm-hmm.
Because the real question is, how do you use that understanding and that framing to make things differently, to do things differently, to structure them differently, and to transform in a second order sense what it is that we do.
Mm. Those are some quite powerful insights. I really appreciate them. And the two that I really heard to take away from that is that we're trying to set the path about what is possible, and that we're building our personal systemic sensibilities and systems literacy. And as each of us do that individually, we're actually building that collaborative capacity. Our capacity is as a society and as a population to come together and, as you said earlier, to reconvene around how we're governing ourselves. But it does often start with our own levels of capacity to think and act in a different way. And in this instance, we would offer that that's thinking in a systemic way. One of the things I remember early on really appreciating about systems is that it draws your attention to specific things in terms of what we need to unpack and examine about the beliefs that we hold about the world, and the willingness to reconsider if those beliefs or values or ways of thinking, our biases as well that we have, are serving us in the things that we're trying to achieve. Some of those ways that we can actually practice in thinking in systems. And so even if we're asking ourselves, what are the things that are informing the way that I see the system or how I believe the system to be formed, can be a good starting point for us to start to enter into this learning journey, but really being open to unlearning what we think we know about the system. I wanted to I think shortly maybe jump to some questions so that people have a chance to engage with you. But before we do that, I guess I want to give you a chance is there anything that we haven't touched on in this very rich conversation today that you would really hope that people would take away from what you're offering in the book in particular, but perhaps also more broadly about why is the time now? Why is our attention to these things now? What are you hoping that we leave with today? And that might be what you've shared in the book.
Well, as we draw to a close and time, I realise there are just so many things that are in the book that I haven't even been able to touch on. And
well, let's go there, because this is important. So,
well, there are 5 chapters, I think, about of how we think things could be done differently. It's not as if we just analyse the problem and leave it at that. We have 5 chapters devoted to how we think things could be done differently. one of those chapters and one concept we haven't talked about much is feedback. I mean, a key systems notion is feedback, and why our relationship has broken down with the biophysical world is that we don't operate feedback dynamics properly, appropriately. We don't have the right institutions, and they're too attenuated to deal with appropriately. And this is a classic cases in water and water governance issues. So how you build institutions that incorporate feedback dynamics is a really critical issue. In one chapter in the book, I talk about the practices of what I call deframing, framing and reframing. If we're stuck in a world where what we've invented in the past is all around us, and we just take it as for granted, like we take for granted that we should, in Australia, drive on the right-hand side of the road. That's a particular institutional arrangement. I mean, there's no reason we should, but we do, and it's not a particular institution I want to challenge. But I do want to make the point that we live with a massive number of institutions which we humans have invented and formalised or enact informally, which I think constrain us from imagining what the future is. And one of the advantages of the current circumstances is that what seemed impossible just only a couple of months ago now seem possible. Could you imagine a Conservative government spending so much money, you know, to essentially to overturn the essential tenets of neoliberalism? The Institute of Public Affairs must be sort of turning in its collective grave, I hope. So we've got to deframe. We can't reinvent the future if we don't deframe a lot of our current understandings and reframe for the future. So that, and one of the, I mean, one device to do that, which builds on quite a bit of research I've done with others in the past, is what I call metaphor impact assessment. I mean, we humans live in language, and a lot of our metaphors shape what we do, even though we're not aware of it. And so when you're thinking about building an initiative, framing a new project, how about a little rapid metaphor impact assessment and say, what is that telling us about how we're thinking about this situation? And what other metaphors might we draw into the conversation as a way of doing things differently? So that's just one of the many examples. There's a chapter there about how you build constitutions and the role of rebuilding constitutions. But constitutions are things for not only for nation states. Constitutions, in a way, frame how we engage with all sorts of things, how the state engages with its communities, because these are essentially constituting rules that we put in place. And a lot of those constituting rules are things that we need to revisit, because the Westminster system is quite, it's structured in a way that power always flows up to the minister. And that distorts a huge amount of learning and feedback and the delegation of power to local people. And so that is another dynamic which is necessary if one wishes to engage in social learning or to genuinely enact co-design processes, for example. Mm. And we have there, Seanna, the work from your work with a whole set of practices that one can do every day that you've highlighted from your work in the health sector and the TAPSI project. Systems thinking in practice isn't actually that hard. Mm. It only becomes hard if you let a lot of language that you're not used to get in your way.
Mm, yes, that's so true. Another phrase that I've borrowed from you and definitely use quite a lot in my work is, what do you mean when you say? To really unpack and not make assumptions about the language that we're using, and that because it's our ability to bridge and connect with others in the system. You said the book doesn't offer much of a blueprint, but I think you've just articulated how significantly it does offer us guidance in how we navigate into this future that we're seeking, and particularly that there's a real potential and opportunity, I think a real desire as well, if I'm to speak broadly, that we're sensing now, which is not to return to business as usual. My interpretation and feeling of what we're experiencing right now, I've started to speak about it as the Great Reset. And so I feel like this context in which we're in, you've talked about systems helping us to interpret history and have that experience and sense making of where we've come from. And I think that's really happening now. And as you say, we're seeing how quickly things can actually change and be completely deframed and reframed. And so we talk in systems work, don't we, about energy and momentum for change. And we're trying to fall in line with that, fall in line with the flow, like in a river going around rocks and other obstructions. And it seems right now that there's that real unbreaking of what was, and an opportunity to re-examine all of the things in our Constitution, as you said, as our values and beliefs that we hold about how society should be operating. And that opportunity now to re-examine that, and whose voices, and we talk a lot about this in systems, whose voices should be informing how we shape what those values and beliefs are about how we operate. We're just on 12 o'clock now, and I would really love to go to questions, but I'm going to pose you the question again, because I'm sure there's more gems that we haven't even got to. Is there one last piece, Ray, that you want to make sure that you're able to share with everyone on the call today about what's in the book, or from your experience and work and practice, that we just want to make sure not to miss out today before we go to questions?
Thank you, Seanna. You're very generous. As you were speaking then, I was reminded of a person who's, the words of a person who's been very influential in my own work, a Chilean scholar called Umberto Maturana, who was, I guess, quite internationally famous for his, what he called the biology of love work, and his Instituto Matristica in Santiago. But he makes the point that human living is always a wavefront of being in the present, that the past and the future are just different manners of being in the present. And so in terms of what it is that we do, every moment is an initial starting condition to a future yet lived. And the one thing we must do, I feel, through this pandemic is to take seriously that the opportunity we've provided to take advantage of these new sets of initial starting conditions that are happening with us right now. Because it is the time to produce or to explore and to talk about new trajectories. And in terms of, I would invite you all to be alert to historical framings that you think are no longer adequate, to challenge particular framings. And I must say I have a particular bugbear, which goes right back to my university days when I had to study agricultural economics, and I couldn't understand why they treated people like they did in agricultural economics. I recommend to all Australians this marvellous book by Jonathan Aldred called License to be Bad: How Economics Has Corrupted Us. And I think this book is particularly apposite to the Australian context, where politically and culturally economics has become so ideologically embedded. And I would invite people here, whenever you see a framing which says the economy must get back to normal, then that is absolutely the wrong framing. The right framing is to say, how do we humans want to live together as we move forward into the future? And further down the track, you can say, well, what might be the economic implications of those choices? But start with social purpose, not with the economy. And I argue quite a bit in the book, or consistently, that the economy is merely one way of being social. And it's not the only way of being social.
Oh, always real gems, because there's so much in that, right? In paying attention to which relationships do we give attention to? Which relationships in the system allow us to, do we give permission to dictate the system and how it's generated, the system and how it's perpetuated? Ah, good ones. And you're so sneaky, Ray. You just shared someone else's book, and here we are spending this time to share about your book. So I'm just going to read from Ray's current book, in the many that he's produced, The Hidden Power of Systems Thinking, Governance in a Climate Emergency. It is available now and as an ebook for download and reading. So what I'd love to do now, Ray, is invite folks to offer questions in the chat. And I'm going to share those with Ray, and it's likely we won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. And I know some folks have dropped some in already. So I'm going to invite you to continue to add questions into the chat. And I'm just going to take a quick peek here and see what we've got so far. So I think our first question we're sitting with Ray from Mariana is, do you see models such as cosmopolitanism as the way forward? And if so, how do you see the current role of technology as both an enabler and threat to achieve this devolved governance arrangement? So around cosmopolitan, is it our way forward? And associated with that, is technology our enabler or a threat in order to achieve this devolved governance?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you all for your questions. And I apologize in advance if I can't answer them all here in this session. And I invite you to follow up with me at any stage. I probably don't understand the concept cosmopolitanism particularly well. I do understand the part about technology. So I'll start with the technology part of the question. Most of us actually don't understand and have a theory of technology that we bring to our everyday living. I like to think of technology as part of a relational dynamic. And I haven't had a chance to share with you the different metaphors of governance that we talk about in the book. But one metaphor of governance is to see humans in a co-evolutionary dynamic with the biosphere, because to me, it doesn't make sense to frame our current circumstances as needing to save the Earth. The Earth and the biosphere will continue without us, Homo sapiens, as the pandemic demonstrates. The key issue is what relational dynamic do we humans want with the biosphere as we move forward, and how do we want to affect the biosphere, other species, and each other as we move forward. So what is the quality of our dynamic with the biosphere that we want to maintain, sustain, continue as we move forward? And if you understand that as a dynamic relationship between humans and the biosphere, then technology mediates our relationship. Technology is a bit like a pair of shoes that we humans walk when we walk on the Earth. It governs the quality of our walking. It mediates the direction and flow and whether it's safe or not safe. And so understanding technology rather than as a thing, but as a mediating object between dynamics is, to me, more important. So the question always is, does cosmopolitanism or whatever hard artifactual technology or social technology, in fact, you can think of institutions as a form of social technology, how do they mediate our practices, and what qualities or affordances do they give to our living? So those are sort of the key questions that the book engages with and talks about and exemplifies perhaps a bit more than I'm able to do here. And I'm sure I haven't answered your question very well, so I apologise to the question asker.
But that mediation, I think, is a really important aspect, Ray. And in one of Ray's previous books, Systems Practice, How to Act in a Climate Change World, which I also reference often and have learned so much about, there's your use of metaphor and imagery to help to relate to these concepts is incredibly helpful and useful. And I always think of the walker and their shoes on the ground and what are we actually feeling and touching. There's a great question here. What do you know of what kind of conditions? So you started to speak to this about kind of the enabling conditions or starting conditions. So what kind of conditions, they've said in the past, but I'm going to say what might we even look for in the future, but what kind of conditions have enabled a radical redesign of institutions and government? So we've talked a little bit about the role of the individual and our capacity to build systemic sensibilities and systems literacy, but what other kind of preconditions are necessary to help us enable that redesign of institutions and governance, right?
Well, that's a very big question. It's a very important question, and it again depends on how we each as individuals, what theories of change we hold and how we think change in the world comes about. My theory of change is that change only comes about through changes in social systems, in conversation, in relational dynamics, and conversation is it's also about discourse building and things of that nature. But if we look historically, well, wars and revolutions have caused change. They're not pathways I particularly wish to advocate or go down. Peaceful change in governance systems happened in Australia. All the Dominion countries, when they felt that they wanted to be independent of Britain or the colonial state, the colonising nation, citizens came together. They often disenfranchised, unfortunately, Indigenous people, and it was on the back of dispossession. So there were those issues that understand that change dynamic. More recently, you see the change in South Africa, which was a new constitution built on the back of the abolition of apartheid. It's a very modern constitution in South Africa, but it hasn't, and we talk about this in the book, it hasn't stopped state capture, i.e. the state in cohorts with the private sector capturing many of the resources of the state. On the other hand, the legal system in South Africa and the media have stood up rather robustly and stopped it completely disintegrating. So there are some pluses and minuses in that context. More recently, you see some interesting experiments in constitutional innovation and reform in Iceland. Many people know about the referenda model in Switzerland that operates. And one set of examples we give in the book is the comparison between the referenda that was conducted in Ireland pre the abortion vote versus the, say, Brexit referendum in the UK. The Brexit referendum was a disaster in its conceptual and practical sense, whereas the Irish abortion referendum was done extremely well because they had in advance of that a national citizens' assembly and other people who informed and deliberated and created a political milieu in which people went to the referendum informed about what the options were.
Di, I've just got you come off mute, if you would mind going back on mute. Ray, I wonder if, just adding to that, because you've started to address one of the one of the next questions that somebody asked as well, which is where are we seeing more advanced democracies and ways of governing evolving? And I think one of the other examples that I've heard in the last years is in Scotland as well, where there's been quite a participatory process to reconsider governance there. I'm just going to, we've still got, there we are. I'm going to move to the next question here, which is asking about, is the loss of relational ways of working true across the board in our communities? What can human-centered design bring to systems approaches? So it's asking about, have we lost the relational ways of working? And what can human-centered design bring to systems approaches?
Thank you for the question. It's again an important one, and we make the point in the book that it's not all humans who've lost their systemic sensibilities. In fact, when I have the opportunity to say this, I say one should try and understand Indigenous Australian Aboriginal cosmology and their relational understanding with the biosphere. One should visit the Museum of the American Indian in Washington or New York and understand how those societies have institutionalized what I would call a systemic sensibility, largely, not all of them, but many of them. So much so that, say, if you take the Hopi as a particular group of Amerindians, I mean, their language is one of only verb construction. So their engagement with the world is always through verbs of enactment, of being in the world and doing in the world. Whereas our Western languages derived from Latin and other things are noun-based languages, and we, despite the fact that we learn language by a relational dynamic, we soon fall through the structures of what language is into thinking the world is full of these things, these nouns which exist independently of their distinction. So living in language is a particular problem in some ways, in particular languages. Where was I going with that, Seanna? What was it? Tell me the rest of the question, please.
Yeah, so I think you've spoken to the relational component, and Andrea and Nicole in the chat have also just added about the Maori in New Zealand and a relational way of working, and also how present that is in the cultural institutions there. The second part of the question was asking about how human-centered design what can it bring to systems approaches? And I find this question, I know we've got a few folks on the call who come from a design background, and it's something I'm even interrogating in my practice, and I'm wondering your thoughts as well. So yes, human-centered design, what does it bring to systems approaches? Or I think the question more broadly is, what is the opportunity to integrate those two things in service of this need that you've been discussing, to return to our ways of governing?
Well, I think what I call systemic design is absolutely central to all of this. And the great advantage that design has as a particular set of discourses is that design is both a verb and a noun. So when you design, you're always doing something, whereas when you system, you're not always doing something. And so that's why we talk about in our program systems thinking in practice. You know, it's a verb construction of the concept of system and thinking systemically, and we highlight the adjectives systemically and systematically. So systemic design, I wrote a paper in 1993 which was called Participative Eco-Design, in which I talked about the need to no longer see nature as a natural state, but actually a state in which we humans were actually designing because of our actions. And I therefore think that we suffer certain problems from the way in which science is constructed rather than design. And so I would say systems and design are really key disciplinary understandings for moving into the future. And I just like to give my Open University a plug here, because when it was set up in 1969, they recruited a dean to a faculty of technology who was very prescient. He said, I don't want a faculty of traditional engineering. I want to have a faculty of technology, because technology is going to be how we mediate our relationships. And I want to have that faculty inhabited by disciplines of analysis with disciplines of synthesis. And he had traditional engineering disciplines of analysis, mechanical engineering, electronics, etc. But his two disciplines of synthesis were systems and design. And so I think what he set out to do in 1969 is just as relevant today. In fact, I think it's even more relevant today, because we don't see as much of it as we did then.
So that's synthesis is sense making. How are we interpreting, and how can we understand what it is that's happening? And it's I think part of that systemic sensibility that you've talked about, that we have that inherently in ourselves, and yet it's often trained out of us. And so return to disciplines that help us to do that, practices that help us to do it, are so critical. There's a couple of other questions here. I'm just, so one of the questions that has come through is, the need for change is well established and written about, but the practical exploratory steps to create what's next are now needed. So how can this be done in a cohesive way? So the question is, what are the practical exploratory steps that we can apply in a cohesive way in order to create what's next needed? So I think it's that application piece, which we've touched on a bit. I guess, is there anything else that you'd like to add to that? How do we do this? How do we do this, Ray?
Well, let me pick up on the answer to the last question and say, if you accept that everything that we do is embodied and situated, then each of us has the wherewithal, or the, I might say, ethical responsibility to be open to our circumstances in the situation, and to ask the question, what is going on here? What is it that we're doing when we do what we do in this situation? And if you're open to the phenomena of concern, whether it's poverty issues, homelessness, water quality issues, or other things, if you're open to the phenomena, then you ask the question, is what we're doing here in this situation systemically adequate? And if it's not, how do we design something differently? So you need to, in my view, engage with the phenomena of concern, be open to your circumstances, and to be able to be critically reflexive about that. And the systemic family therapists had a set of concepts that I think apply here, which are quite useful. This was back in the 70s or 80s, and they referred to system-determined problems and problem-determined systems. And so if you're open to the situation, or a problem or an issue, then you construct a system to deal with it. But if you're in a system and you want the system to continue, then the system invents the problem to which it responds.
There's something,
or it responds in its terms that perpetuate the system.
There's something I think quite clear and simple about that, which is us just being openly transparent about what's in front of us. There's something that we talk a lot about in the systems community of practice, which is that our ways to do systems and systems thinking itself is not complex as a practice, but it's the commitment to practicing and responding to the things that we're learning and acting on the things that we're learning, where the real work and the real effort is. And I think you've articulated that nicely, is really looking at what's in front of us and examining that phenomenon.
Can I just come in there, Seanna, just one other thing, because it's a language that's being used quite a lot about the need for system change, and we need to map the system. Now, these are okay, but they have limitations in the sense that if you assume there is a system out there and you can map it, and you don't bring in multiple perspectives and different people to challenge where you draw the boundary, then you run the trap of being locked in to just your interpretation of the system. That's a problem. And the other thing is, what you think might be a system, the problem actually may be it isn't a system, because there's no connection between a espoused purpose and what is going on. And so it could be the failure for a system to exist that is the issue, rather than the necessary to change the system.
I think we've all got some good nuggets to take away from this today. We're just coming up to time, and there's a last question that I think's a nice one to close out on. And the question was, what have you noticed emerging in the current pandemic that offers seeds of hope for shifting towards better governance systems? I always like to close on the positive. So Ray, what are you seeing right now in these current contexts that we're existing in, which are giving us some seeds of hope about how our systems might be designed differently, operate differently, become different?
It's a challenging question in a way, Seanna. I mean, I'll offer two things. One is a more generic one, and I think the more generic one is that the majority of the world's governments chose that we should be compassionate with other humans and choose to place their future, their lives, as a priority. So we stepped over concern about the economy. Now, that's under threat at the moment, and there's some terrible stuff going on in the US and other places and things of that nature. But for many people, that was important. Whether it was in China, I reserve judgment. The other thing is, there's been just an interesting thing happen in Britain, which, I mean, having worked in Britain a lot, I regard Britain as almost virtually a failing state, certainly England. Under the leadership of a past chief scientist, they have set up a science panel, a private citizens, an independent civil society panel to equate with the formal government panel, to dispense and to analyse these complex issues and to provide transparent advice to the citizenry, independent of political influence. This is led by Sir David King. It's only just happened in the last few days, and it's essentially about how to operate around a specific issue, which is the response to the pandemic. But at the moment, one of the reasons the British governance system is failing is that there's no transparency. There's political influence through advisors and the executive into the operations of the scientific committees, as typified by their failure to get going early and the influence of nudge economics understandings in the early days, etc. So what we see there is what we argue in the book. Most innovation is going to come from the emergence of new institutional forms in civil society.
Beautiful. We're going to leave it there, Ray. I can't thank you enough for your time, but also your contributions to systems thinking, to systems practice. You've brought so much to this field, and I'm really grateful for your time to share all of that with our community today. Ray's a number of fantastic books, but his most recent one, The Hidden Power of Systems Thinking. What I'd love to invite you to do now, just as we check out, is if you'd like to share in the chat, if you have a moment, what you're taking away. What is your key takeaway from today's conversation? And to thank you all so much for your presence, your contribution in questions, and if this is something that you enjoyed in the space, it's open to anyone, and you can find more information at the Systems School website. So thank you again so much, Ray, for your time today. Beautiful conversation. We'll be sharing the recording if you want to share that with your colleagues who may have not been able to join today through the Community of Practice newsletter. And we'll see you all soon. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
I just wanted you to have a chance to see these takeaways, Ray, that folks are sharing.